Welcome back. The newest executive at each federal agency could be the customer experience officer. Matt Lear of the Office of American Innovation at the White House says the job could be similar to the chief data officer job structurally. Danny Werfel's managing director and partner at the Boston Consulting Group, former acting commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. Danny, welcome. Thanks for coming on the program. What is the benefit of having an executive do this job rather than just strengthening customer experience all across an agency and building those concepts into processes?
Well, I mean, one of the main reasons you might create a chief officer around this discipline is that you have one person that you can go to that's accountable. Someone who goes to bed at night thinking about it and wakes up in the morning thinking about how do we improve customer experience. Whereas if you try to spread it across the organization, you're just adding it to the plate of a lot of different responsibilities those individuals already have. Now, obviously, on the other side of this is you're creating more bureaucracy and increasing the number of chief officers you have, and there's a downside of that as well. So you have to figure out where the biggest priorities are for you to add these types of positions in the government.
Matt Lear, as I mentioned a moment ago, said that these positions should not be vaporware. Talked about this pretty extensively at the Executive Leadership Conference that ACT-IAC did virtually last week. My view is that if we create positions, we need to make sure they're not just vaporware. How do you evaluate candidates for these jobs to make sure that they're really doing something, they're really making an impact?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to make sure that the organization is ready to embrace this role. So I start with role clarity, that everyone in the organization knows what the mission and remit of a new chief officer is around customer experience or around anything else. You know, we've seen the advent of chief data officers and chief risk officers, and yes, you have to get the right person with the right experience set who can bring in experiences in other organizations and in other industries and successfully launching these types of efforts. But I think, if you don't have the organization clearly understanding why this role is being created, what its remit is, and that it does have the authorities of the leader of the agency to carry out that remit, you're really starting not in a great place, and it's likely that the organization won't embrace what they're trying to do here.
Every agency does surveys of its customers internally and externally. The biggest internal survey, I guess, is the FEVs. But how do you measure the success of a CXO? Is it just the customers, especially the external customers? Is it just the surveys that you get back from them after a period of time, or is there another way to judge whether a CXO is successful?
Well, that's why you have to establish that clear mission and what are they trying to achieve, and you have to do it in a time-based way. What do we want stood up in the first 3 months, the first 6 months, the first 9 months? And then if you're talking about a customer experience officer, then you want to establish a baseline for what how you're measuring the customer satisfaction of your agency and how external stakeholders are experiencing. So it may be that right now you don't have a strong measurement. So the first milestone for the new chief is to establish a strong measurement program. Then you got to establish a baseline, and you got to measure it over time. And so these things are not something that happens overnight. Now, if you're ahead of the curve and you already have a strong measurement program, maybe you're bringing in this new C-suite officer to really kind of catalyze some innovation to really try to understand what the customers need and really try to get better performance on those metrics. But each organization is going to be in a different point of maturity. And so the new chief executive that comes in is really going to have to figure out where are we on that maturity curve, and the success of that individual and the new organization they're standing up will be what is the next milestone on that maturity curve that we need to achieve.
All right, you alluded to something at the beginning of this conversation that I noticed right away when I read about this, And that is, at what point do we have too many C-suite officers, Danny? Do we have too
Yeah.
many people going in different directions or with different missions that have to fit into a mosaic across an agency?
Yeah, I mean, there is a point at which you're diluting the effectiveness, and I think it's interesting. There's a way to look at this agency by agency, and basically saying, look, we're not going to create a new C-suite position across every agency in government, but we're going to look at different agencies and figure out what makes the most sense for that agency. Should they embed it within existing responsibilities? Like, for example, should this be a responsibility of the chief information officer or the chief financial officer, so that we're capitalizing on an existing C-suite organization? Or do we actually need, for this particular organization, a whole new office to focus on it? And it's going to depend on the organization. So my standpoint would be, if I was at OMB or the White House at this point, I would ask each agency to come back and say, what's the best way to achieve the objective? Is it to embed it into your existing organizational structure, or is there benefit in creating a new position just dedicated to this? And really not have a one-size-fits-all, but figure it out across agency.
Danny Werfel, thanks very much as always.
My pleasure, Francis.